All right, welcome everyone. My name is Fida Adeli and I'm the Academic Director of the Arab Studies Program. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the third lecture in our Maksoud lecture series on Arab human development. And the lecture series has been generously funded by the Betty Sams Family Foundation. Just wanted to let you know that. And tonight we have the pleasure of having Professor Ragui Assaad with us. Professor Ragui Assaad with us. He is a professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he chairs the Global Policy Area and co-chairs the Master of Development Practice program. He's been a research fellow of the Economic Research Forum since 1994 and currently serves as thematic leader for labor and human resource development, as well as a member of its board of trustees. He's also a research fellow of the Institute for the Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. His research interests include labor policy, labor market analysis, inequality of opportunity in education, health, labor markets, transitions from school to work, employment and unemployment, informality, labor market responses to economic shocks, international migration, and family formation. I know I've benefited tremendously from the work that he's done on labor policy, labor dynamics in the region, and particularly in Jordan. He has also worked as a consultant for the World Bank and the International Labour Organization, the Ford Foundation, UNICEF, and UNDP, and has numerous publications, too many to enumerate. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And I'll hand it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fida.
Yeah.
So I want to make this very informal, and hopefully, economists are always interrupting the speakers. I know you're not economists, but please do that. I want to have more of a conversation. There are few enough of us that I don't mind at all interruptions and questions as I go. And if I think we're going too much off track, I'll let you know. So I'm really not going to be able to cover that entire very broad topic. So we're going to make it a little bit narrower as we go along. But this fits within, for the past 5 years or so, I've been working on this issue of inequality of opportunity in the Arab world on an Economic Research Forum project. And I'll show you kind of various issues and questions that we've been asking. But today I'm going to focus on really two papers that we've been working on together with John Romer, who is kind of Mr. Inequality of Opportunity. He's kind of the main theorist behind that whole concept, who wrote a very important book in 1998, kind of theorizing how we can measure inequality of opportunity. So John Romer was invited to an ERF conference to be kind of one of the speakers, and after that we said, okay, how can we collaborate on something? And we roped him in to do this work with us. So we have these two papers looking at inequality of opportunity in income and consumption. One that's kind of comparative across three MENA countries, Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, and one that is more in-depth about Egypt, looking at how inequality of opportunity is changing over time in Egypt. This is kind of pretty data-intensive stuff, so the data does not allow us to do everything we need for all the countries, and so we have to be selective in terms of what countries and what kind of analysis we're able to do. So we know that social justice was a very central issue in the Arab Spring, and there has been a great deal of talk about social justice together with freedom and democracy and other sorts of issues. And so you'd think that grievances about rising inequality would be driving these demands for social justice and the grievances that have been expressed in the Arab Spring. But in fact, if you look at the data, the available data do not support the perception of rising inequality. This is something that has been dubbed the Arab inequality puzzle by some people at the World Bank, which is basically, we look at the various ways of looking at the data, conventional ways of looking at the data, and the inequality is actually quite low by international standards and declining. And so this is some of that data where we're looking at the Gini Index, the most common way of measuring inequality. This is applied to consumption data because income data is much more difficult to get at and much less reliable in the region. And so generally we ask people about their expenditures and their consumption as reflected by these expenditures, and do the inequality of consumption as opposed to income. But that's very common around the world. And so we have data on consumption from other parts of the world. And you can see that we don't stand out as being very high. Latin America and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa are quite a bit higher. And the trend for the MENA region is downward with this Gini Index, as opposed to what people have in mind as being upward. Now, when you look at individual country data, again, here, this is the same thing, Gini coefficient at the country level, measured in the averages for the 1990s and the 2000s. And you see that the Arab Spring countries in particular, maybe with the exception of Tunisia, do not have very high inequality. And in some cases, you see inequality actually declining across those 2 decades. But you know, Yemen, Egypt, Syria, not particularly high. Tunisia, somewhat higher, and then the more African countries, Mauritania and Djibouti, are more like the Sub-Saharan African numbers. Egypt is the one country where we have more time trends, and so I'm going to use primarily Egypt to look at change over time because we have data from a number of years. And this is calculating in the same way the Gini coefficient for consumption data over time, starting in the late 50s, in fact. And what you can see also is a fairly stable downward trend, which kind of flies in the face a little bit of all the concern about inequality that we've been hearing. And so this is a puzzle that partly I'm going to try to deal with it. And one question that has been asked, well, maybe it's the way we measure things. And so there's been a lot of effort to try and look into issues that may arise with measuring inequality using consumption data or expenditure data. And maybe income is different from consumption, and that in particular at the higher end of the income distribution, it may deviate. Income may be significantly different from consumption, which is a possibility. We don't have very good data on income, so it's hard to confirm that. But there's also the issue that there's some evidence that the top incomes, in particular the top part of the consumption or expenditure distribution, is not very well measured. And that is because people who are at the top 5% or so of the income distribution are not very nice to enumerators. They kick them out, they refuse to answer questions, they don't open the door for them. So very high refusal rates. And you know, when you're missing even 5%, you could be missing a lot of the income. I mean, in the US, something like the top 5% have 45% of the income. So that's possible. There's been some work to try and deal with this. These are some references. The first one, just try to use some additional evidence on the income distribution at the very top to kind of fill in the distribution. Didn't get very far in terms of getting very much more unequal results. The second reference is using real estate data and the relationship to real estate and income, and got all this real estate prices from kind of advertising for real estate in Egypt, and did get much higher measures of inequality, but it's not clear how representative the real estate data that they were using is. So still there are some question marks, and it's not clear that they haven't been able to work on the trend, just on the fact that you do correct those Gini coefficients upward if you do real estate data. Now, of course, we don't have data on wealth inequality, and that's a big deal. We know that a lot of the inequality that in the region is basically made up of real estate holdings. Real estate has been going up very fast. The value of real estate is going up very fast in many countries, especially prior to the Arab Spring, and that could have really drawn the wealth inequality, pushed the wealth inequality quite high. There is some effort now to try and get access to land holding and ownership of land, but there's very little on ownership of real estate in terms of public data sources. So yes, there may be an issue there, and wealth inequality may be the issue. And then finally, the question may not be just the fact that there is inequality, but there may be a sense that the economic game is rigged, that basically you're not able to get ahead because you don't have the right family background or you don't have the right connections. And so this is kind of more of an inequality of opportunity rather than simply a question that there is inequality as such. And so this is really where I'm going to focus today's attention, is how to try and get at this inequality of opportunity idea. Now, so as I said, this is part of a much larger project in which we looked. I know this is too much to look at. I just wanted to, so the first two papers here with John Romer are the one I'm going to be presenting results from today, but there will be many other papers in this, and I'll make available the slides, so if you want to get the details, but on inequality of opportunity in human development, inequality of opportunity in the labor market, specifically looking at higher education graduates in Egypt and Jordan, inequality of opportunity in educational achievement, so this is in test scores, how people perform on international tests of math and science, inequality of opportunity in educational attainment, looking at about 7 or 8 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and then finally inequality of opportunity in child health in the Arab world and Turkey. So you can really apply this to a number of possible outcomes. But what I'm going to focus on today is inequality of opportunity in income and consumption. I'm going to introduce John Romer's framework for measuring inequality of opportunity, which has been very influential in this literature. I'm going to then look at applying those specifically to wages and consumption in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. However, the data for Jordan and Tunisia are such that we don't have multiple dates, multiple times in the data. It's just one survey in each. So we're not able to look at trends over time. But for Egypt, we do have 4 comparable surveys that have the necessary data on family background. The key issue here is that we need to know the social background of every adult in the sample, and that's not present except in a very, very few data sets. So for Egypt, we have data from '88 all the way through 2012, and we're able to kind of look at how these have changed over time. And then in Egypt, we have an additional advantage of having panel data. And panel data means data in which you follow the same individuals and household over time across different waves of the survey. So you observe them first in, let's say, 1998, where they were young adults or young people living with their parents. And so you observe a lot of things about their natal household. And then in 2012, you observe them as adult workers who are earning and having their own income outcomes, etc. And then you have a lot more information about their backgrounds when they were growing up from the previous data. So that's kind of the richest data we have, and I'll show you can get better results, but at the same time, it's only the 2012 outcomes that we can explain using the panel. So it's limited in terms of time comparisons. But given all that, we should be able to at least. So now the very last thing I'm going to do in this talk is, okay, given that I'm going to give you the punchline, inequality of opportunity in Egypt was declining, which means that opportunities are becoming more equal, at least according to the measures that we are using. So how come? What's happening? How can we square that finding? It's like inequality declining. In fact, inequality, the part of inequality that's due to opportunities or due to the lack of the circumstance, people's family background and circumstances, is actually declining. And so how do we what do we make of that? So, all right. So John Romer's framework. Basically, inequality of opportunity, he says, is that part of inequality that is due to someone's circumstances that are beyond their control. as opposed to inequality that results from their own choices and their own effort. So anything that is based on your family background, where you grew up, where you were born, what your gender is, that is circumstances. And that inequality is what we call inequality of opportunity. There may be other additional aspects of the inequality in the outcomes of your income, etc., that may be based on your own actions. So the circumstances that we could look at are socioeconomic status of your natal family, where you grew up, gender, of course, the location of birth, the race and ethnicity, and these circumstances are things that are beyond an individual's control. Whereas the effort could include how far you went in school. So if you're a good student and went further, what occupation you decided to enter, how much you studied when you were in school, how hard you worked. So this is we're going to call effort. However, it should be very clear that effort depends often on circumstances. So people who, because of their circumstances, see that they are advantaged, they might work harder and they might go further. And so clearly effort is not independent of circumstances. But that's the challenge, is to try and kind of separate how much of the inequality of outcome is due to things outside an individual's control, which we're going to call circumstances, and things that they can control. So Romer's position, and I think all of us would believe, that inequality due to circumstances is morally unjustifiable, that the things that you cannot control it's not fair that they should affect your income and consumption outcomes. However, inequality due to choices may in fact be ethically admissible, if not kind of desirable, to provide the appropriate incentives for people to work harder and for people to make the right decisions. So if you're kind of thinking about a situation where you want to have people have incentives, having some inequality in outcomes that's based on effort is morally justifiable. And clearly, what outcomes you apply this framework to can vary. So we applied it to educational attainment and achievement, type and quality of job that you might get, and in this particular presentation, I'm going to apply it to kind of income and consumption of adults. Consumption of whole households based on the characteristics of the head of the household, and income of adult wage earners. So the issue here then is to take overall inequality and decompose it into the part of that inequality that is due to circumstances and the part of inequality that is due to effort. So here are the problems we encounter. First problem, effort is hard to measure, right? You're not going to ask people in a survey, how hard did you work? Or, so we have a problem in directly measuring effort, and the method has to kind of get around that. Now, circumstances are more measurable. However, they're measured imperfectly. So, for example, we know what level of education your father had, or what level of education your mother had, but we have no idea what sort of school your father went to, whether it was elite school or a government public school, or that sort of thing. So you have a lot of details that could be very important in terms of measuring class background and social background that may not be available in the data. The third issue is, as I said earlier, effort itself is a function of circumstances. So you should not be held accountable for differences in effort that are due to circumstances. And here is an example that John Romer always gives and kind of gets people a bit riled up. So take Asian kids in the US versus, let's say, white kids. And there is a tradition that Asian families push their kids to work much harder. And so the amount of effort that Asian kids put into their studies and essentially is higher because Asian families tend to push their kids hard. And so Romer would then say, well, the better outcomes that Asian kids may get because they have more effort are not justifiable. because it's actually due to the fact that they come from Asian families. And
You never come
so he would say that people should, the amount of effort that they exert should be compared to people with similar circumstances as they are. And that's the effort that they should be rewarded for. But people across different circumstances, you cannot really compare that effort fairly. So anyway, that's kind of his position. And then the final problem is that there are circumstances like your native ability, right? Your IQ, or that in fact are circumstances, things you do not control, that are very difficult to distinguish from effort, right? And very difficult to measure as circumstances. So in effect, we're going to treat effort as the residual. What we cannot explain by observed circumstances is going to be automatically put in the effort column, which means that we're going to underestimate the effect of circumstances. Because in effort, you have things like luck, you have things like native ability, and you have things like unobserved circumstances. They're all going to be put in the effort column, which means, in fact, what we can attribute to circumstances in the data is going to be a lower bound estimate of inequality of opportunity. I'm going to use this acronym a lot. IOP means inequality of opportunity. So from now on, if you see that, just translate into inequality of opportunity. So essentially, we're going to try to then take people's outcomes in terms of income and consumption, try to explain those, usually using a regression. If those of you know a little bit of statistics, a multiple regression. We're going to explain those using people's circumstances, i.e., what the education of their parents are, where they live, what sort of occupations their parents, if they worked, had, etc. And then the part that is explainable through these circumstances is going to be attributed as inequality of opportunity, and then the rest is going to be attributable to effort. So in order to do that, we can actually, what I explained doing by using a regression is one method, which statisticians would call parametric, meaning we actually do some kind of a regression, whereas we can also do it in a way that is considered non-parametric, where we define different groups, we can call them types, and types are a set of persons having the same set of measurable circumstances. So if you are born in rural Upper Egypt to illiterate parents and you're a girl, you are put in the same type as everybody who shares these circumstances with you. So in a sense, a type is, to the extent that you're measuring circumstances, are people who share the same circumstances. And now, of course, the more circumstances we take into account, the more types we have. And ideally, you want to have many, many different types because you're taking into account lots of details of circumstances. However, you run very quickly into data problems because we have cells in the data that will have very few people in them, and we won't be able to do any good estimation for these cells. So it's a balance between having enough circumstances so you describe what are the things that are affecting, what are the issues that are maybe affecting people's opportunities, while at the same time having not too many so that you're not breaking down the data far too much. So then we're going to take total inequality and divide it into between types inequality. So the inequality between types is the one that is due to being in a different type. And the within type inequality is going to be considered the resulting from effort. So within type is that if you compare people who are exactly similar in terms of their circumstances, girl from Upper Egypt, born in Upper Egypt, whose both parents are illiterate, whose father is an agricultural worker, for example. That's a type. And you're comparing then the outcome for this individual, for all individuals in that type, what the within type inequality is considered due to effort. That's the residual. Whereas the between type inequality is going to be attributed to inequality of opportunity. All right, so this is what we're doing. And now, if it's possible to decompose inequality in this way, then we have our measure of inequality of opportunity. Now, unfortunately, not all inequality measures are decomposable. This is a technical point, but the Gini coefficient, that famous measure of inequality that everybody uses, is not actually decomposable into within and between. And in order to come up, there are people who work on this for a living, came up with something called the general entropy measures, which is a class of inequality measures that is decomposable, where you can divide, if the population is divided into groups of any type, you can look at the inequality between groups and the inequality within groups, and the two together add up to total inequality. That's not the case in the case of the Gini coefficient. So we're going to actually use not the Gini, but specific cases of the general entropy index. There's something called GE0, which is sometimes called the mean log deviation. Some also given the name of tile L index. And this is GE0. GE1, general entropy 1, is the tile T index, which, and then finally there's one called the square of the coefficient of variation. This is a footnote, not important. Important is each one of these indices measures inequality the same way that Gini does. And what we can do is then take the part of inequality as measured by these indices and say this is due to circumstances and the rest is the residual, which we'll claim is due to effort. All right, so how are we going to measure inequality of opportunity? Well, we're going to first divide people into types. Initially, I'm going to make the types fairly simple. 4 types, based on just parental education. And then I'm going to complicate the types by bringing in region of birth and parental occupation. I'll make more types. But to start, it's good to kind of work with a simple typology of people and see what we can get with that. And I'm going to compare the outcome, which is like the consumption or the income of the lowest type to that of the highest type. I'm also going to choose, because in fact, that's what Romer would have suggested, lowest to highest and maybe lowest to rest, except that we found that there was something going on with the middle of the distribution. The middle of distribution is going to be very important to what's going on in this story. And so we decided to look at the middle type to the highest type and also the lowest to the middle, so that we can see. So if you look at the mean wage of the lowest type being those who have both parents illiterate, for example, and the highest type being those who have both parents university educated. So that sort of comparison. And then finally, we're going to do the decomposition and look at the share of between type inequality, which is the inequality due to circumstances, to total inequality. So the share of inequality that's explained by circumstances, which is what we said is a measure of inequality of opportunity. So it's hopefully a fairly simple operation. Now, the data sources, and the reason this is difficult, data is difficult to get, is you need to have a lot of information about people's social backgrounds. And unfortunately, most surveys ask about you, but they don't ask about your parents. And so the few surveys that ask all adults about their parental characteristics are these labor market surveys that were conducted by ERF in cooperation with the respective statistical offices. And so there is, we're going to do cross-country comparisons using the Egypt 2012, Jordan 2010, and Tunisia 2014 surveys. And for Egypt over time, we can have 88, 98, 2006, 2012. Now, these are publicly available data. You can go in and play around with them if you like. Yes?
Yep, Ragui, I would probably also add that they have that information largely because you were also involved in the surveys and designing it all, so.
And it's very easy to access. I've had 2 students work with these data sets for their one for a thesis and one for a paper we're working on together.
Yes, and in fact, Diane helped design one of the surveys, the module that has to do with the marriage, cost of marriage, and the patterns of marriage. And
It's also really, I think it's also very helpful to know it's very, very gendered too.
yes.
There's a tremendous amount of information that's also asks about gendered questions and other kinds of things.
Yes, exactly. But the part that we absolutely need for these surveys is knowing about the parents, knowing about the education and occupation of the parents for all adults in the sample. Now, unfortunately, these surveys are not consumption surveys, so they're not like the household income and consumption surveys where people are asked tediously about every single thing they consumed and they spent money on, which are very long and tedious questionnaires. So we've used a methodology that it was developed for poverty mapping sort of techniques to impute consumption in these surveys using another household income and consumption survey that happened around the same time, and you can do a very good job predicting the consumption level of the household based on characteristics of the household. And so we have used this imputation for consumption in these surveys. We also have wage data, which we measure directly. And wage data is problematic because it depends on who participates in wage labor. And in particular, for the female sample, there's a lot of selection going on because many women decide not to participate, and then a few decide to participate in wage labor. So we decided to focus, in this case, to get away from all these selection issues on males who are ages 30 to 49. So prime age male wage earners, so that we don't deal with either wages at early in the career or very late in the career. And then we also know that not all jobs that have the same wage are equal. So you have a situation where somebody has a stable, formal job with benefits, etc., and somebody may make the same amount of money but with none of the stability or the benefits. And so we did what's called formality adjusted wages, where we used some previous work we did to try and get what is the formality and what it brings worth in terms of wages. So this is just a way to see maybe it's the change in the formality that has resulted in the inequality changing in certain ways. And then finally, we actually can calculate full income, and full income differs from wages by including the income of people who are self-employed or who are have their own family businesses and they're unpaid family workers, etc. So full income requires a lot more data from people who don't just earn a wage, but who have their own family business. And we were able to do that for Egypt in 2012 and Tunisia in 2014. So a lot of work goes into calculating these outcome variables. They're not completely straightforward, but that's kind of explained in the papers. Now, the additional estimates that use the panel data, where we follow the individuals through time, we're actually able to look at individuals who are 26 to 36 in 2012. The reason we don't go further in age because we don't observe them. We need to observe them having been living in their natal households in 1998. So they need to be young enough to still be living with their parents in 1998, and then we observe them again in 2012, and basically we have a lot richer information about the family background of these individuals. We know exactly, for instance, the wealth of the household in which they grew up. And are they poor, are they middle class, are they rich, etc.
What is the number of people in these surveys?
Let's say, so in Egypt, it's 12,000 households in the survey, which, about 5 individuals per household 5 total individuals per household on average. In Jordan, because these were the first waves of the survey, Jordan and Tunisia each had about 5,000 households each. Okay, So how are we going to divide people into types? So we're going to start with a simple typology, which is based on fathers and mothers' education. So we measure education in this variable that has 4 states, from illiterate to university. We lump secondary and post-secondary together. Post-secondary is like 2-year colleges. Basic is either junior high school or elementary school. And literate is not having a certificate but knowing how to read and write, and illiterate. And then we say, okay, we're going to add up those two, the father's and mother's education together. So they each go from 1 to 5. When you add them up, the result goes from 2 to 10. And the reason we don't use them separately because they're very correlated with each other. People tend to marry people who are similar education levels that they are. So when we add them up, we get the sum of 2, meaning both parents are illiterate. We're going to call this type 1, and we're going to dub it as lower class. Okay, so this is not what sociologists think is as a lower class. This is just our definition for lower class is people who both parents are illiterate, where the sum of the educations is 2. And then we're going to lump together the sum from 3 to 5. We're going to call those the middle class, and those are people who have from one parent literate to one parent secondary, and all the combinations, possible combinations of those. So they could be anything where they add up to anywhere from 3 to 5. So you can see literate plus basic would give you such a combination. Literate plus secondary, 2 basic would be 6, so it would be beyond that. And then upper middle class is the sum of 6 to 7 for these education variables. So 2 parents with basic education would fall in the upper middle class. And then the upper class is a sum of 8 to 10 from both parents with secondary, upper secondary education or both parents university. So of course you want to know what is the distribution of the population in these 3 countries across those 4 types. And the reason we kind of lump them together because some of these combinations are less likely than others, and it made sense to do this lumping. And this is the distribution in the 3 countries. So in Egypt, both parents illiterate, you get 51% of the population. So that type 1, you cannot even, we wanted to have a smaller share of type 1, but you can't get less than illiterate. So in Tunisia, it shows you how recent the educational achievements. We think of Tunisia as an educated country with, in fact, both parents illiterate were 63% of, these are parents of males who are currently 30 to 49, so you're thinking about their parents. So you can see here that this now the so-called middle class, where it's is another about 40% in Egypt. Jordan, that's the predominant group, and 25%. And then the so-called, if you thought we defined upper middle class as being somebody whose both parents have basic education as being too generous as an upper middle class, that's only 6% to 9% of the population and then the upper is the top 5% approximately in these 3 countries. So we're going to look at these 4 types. Now, if you look at the change over time of these types, you can see that it didn't change very much. In Egypt, the proportion of the lower group has really remained around 50%, with a little bit more in 1988 where they were 54%. And the middle group has remained around 40% as well, with very small changes. So there's not that because education is changing dramatically over time that these groups are actually, their weight in the population is not changing very much.
The upper middle class didn't move at
Yes,
all.
the upper middle class didn't move at all. The upper class changed because, education did increase a bit among a group of people. So you increase from 2% to 6%. But,
How about the geographic distribution of those samples?
yes, well,
For example,
the
the country like Tunisia, the disparity between, the north
Sure.
and
So
the other side of
later on, I'm going to introduce a more complicated typology, in which I bring in place of birth. And place of birth, we divide each country into 3 regions. So, and the regions then reflect that geographic distribution. And we're going to then overlay the education, the parents' education with the regions. And we're going to add also occupation of the father as being blue collar, white collar, or agricultural. So you're going to get a total of 36 types, right? So 4 education types, 3 regions, times 3 occupations, 36 types. So it's possible to get more complicated, but I think in the beginning it's kind of better to explore with simple typology and then get a more complicated typology. So let's look at the cross-country comparisons. And I know the next set of graphs is going to be scary for some people, but I'm going to try to walk you through them. So these are called cumulative distribution functions. Okay, so what these are is for each type, we rank people from the poorest to the richest in terms of the outcome variable, which is consumption, from the lowest to the highest. And so the way you read those is that if you go to the proportion and go to 0.5 and see where it crosses the graph, that would be the median. 0.5 is half the population. The median household income would be where the 0.5, so the median income of people with lower class, sum of 2, is in Egypt is around 100. Whereas the median consumption of the middle class is around 130 or so. And then the upper middle is around 180, and then the top class, the median is over 200. But you can basically say for every fraction of each of these groups what their consumption level would be. So what you're looking for here is how dispersed these graphs are from each other. The greater the dispersion, the more unequal the types are. We're trying to look at between type inequality. So the further apart they are, the more unequal they are. And you can see also the fact that they don't cross at all. So these types sort the population very well by consumption level. If they crossed, then you would say it's not clear which one is dominant over the other in terms of consumption. But these don't cross, so you can see the dominance. Now, so you can see that already you can see that in Tunisia things are more unequal. The top type is way to the right, whereas in Egypt is intermediate, and in Jordan they are closer together. So there is not as much difference between types in Jordan. You just can take the 50% line as being the median. Okay, so that's one sort of.
Sorry, the cross. So it's not crossing; it's just touching.
Yeah, it's touching. It's basically saying that at the median level, they have the same consumption level, but that just happens to be at one point. Here, yes. So there is some crossing here, which just tells you that it's probably because you see this is very sparse. The data for Tunisia has fewer observations, and so we're not as we're not very precise. But yeah, so that type in the lower end of the distribution. So that let's say if you took the poorest 20% of the upper type and the poorest 20% of the upper middle type, the consumption is about the same. All right. Then we're going to look at, okay, if we take the bottom type and the top type, the bottom type being the 2 parents illiterate, the top type being 2 parents with at least secondary education. So there is about 50, the bottom type has about 50% of the consumption of the top type. And the 3 countries are kind of similar. It's a little bit less in Tunisia, a little bit more in Jordan, but these bars give you the confidence interval, so that's the uncertainty of the estimate. So you cannot say that the bottom type is worse off relative to the top type, is worse off in, let's say, Tunisia than they are in Jordan. They're roughly similar. So in terms of consumption, the same in terms of wages. You can see that, again, the higher the better here. The higher the bottom type is relative to the top type, the better. So in this case, Tunisia looks better. But again, statistically, they are quite similar. And then if you look at income, again, Tunisia looks better in terms of income than Egypt. The bottom type looks like they have a higher share of the mean income of the top type. So what do we say about how these countries relate to each other in terms of economic inequality of opportunity? We can say that we cannot detect very major differences among them. They're about the same in terms of at least that measure of inequality of opportunity. Let's go to the more fine-grained typology that I spoke about earlier. So this is where we look at region divided into metropolitan, provincial, urban, provincial, rural. And metropolitan kind of is defined as the big cities. And we divide the father's occupation into 3 groups. So now we have 36 types. What does that get us? To have 36 types instead of 4. Well, we can explain more with 36 types than we can. So this is the share of inequality that is due to circumstances. If you're only describing circumstances with the 4 types, you explain about 15% of inequality in Egypt is due to circumstances. If you explain circumstances as varying across this more complex typology, you explain about 20% of inequality using with circumstances. In Tunisia, it goes up to 25%. So here you can see at least this measure, which is the share of inequality that is due to circumstances, is higher in Egypt when you're using only the 4 types, parental education alone, but it's higher in Tunisia when you're using region, because as you guessed, region is an important factor in Tunisia, much more important than it is in Egypt. And as a result, you get more inequality of opportunity when you're including region in the typology, in the case of Tunisia, than you get when you're just including parental education. You know, remember, 63% of Tunisians have both parents illiterate. So there's not a lot of variation in the parental education dimension, but there might be a lot more variation in the regional dimension. So if you do it for consumption, you do it for wages, you get pretty much the same picture. So the degree of inequality of opportunity that you're able to explain is about the same in consumption and wages. Now this is where we take the proportion of inequality. So for Egypt, we found that this is a slightly different methodology where we're using the regression instead of the types. But the idea is you take the 30%, which is the amount due to circumstances, and you try to break it up into what are the circumstances that seem to matter the most. Yes?
Sorry, what are you including in circumstances?
So circumstances are parental education, the sum of both father and mother, the region that you're born in, and your father's occupation among these 3 large categories. So blue collar, white collar, and agricultural workers. Now, in this analysis, we include, so basically the 3 groups of circumstances are parents' education, region of birth, and parents' occupation. So this kind of defines what you share in common with other people in your same type. And what this is telling us is that region is pretty big in Tunisia, a little less so in Egypt, and very little in Jordan. There's very little of inequality that's explained by regional differences in Jordan. So, for instance, in Jordan and Tunisia, parental education is explaining about the same, but inequality of opportunity is much higher in Tunisia because of region. And the green part is due to the occupation of the father. So that kind of tells you, okay, where is the source of that inequality? Where is it coming from?
So if only 10% is being explained by circumstance, is the assumption then that 90% is effort?
Or unobserved circumstances.
Okay.
So unobserved, in the case of Jordan in particular, so ethnicity, for example, whether you're a Palestinian or a Jordanian is not observed. If we observed it, we could include it. But unfortunately, we're not allowed to ask that question, right? And so there is an issue here.
But then is there any way to sort of estimate for those unobserved circumstances or factors so you know how big that is in relation to stuff that you're counting?
Sure. So what I'm going to do is show you in the case of Egypt, when we do use the panel and are able to observe a lot more stuff, right? Because when you're observing people in their native household, you can observe a lot more stuff. How much more explanatory power do we get? And that gives you a sense of, it's not all circumstances are observable, even if you observe people in their native household, but it'll give you a sense of how much you can stretch those estimates. So I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, so this is a sense of kind of where's the inequality coming from. And now, when we're looking at Egypt over time in a minute, you will see that the role of region has actually declined a lot over time. This is 2012 in Egypt. In 1988, region played a much bigger role. So there is greater equalization across regions in Egypt, whereas the effect of parental education has remained fairly constant. So it gives you kind of a sense of the role of these various factors. Now this is compared to other countries for which a similar exercise was done. But these countries tend to be, so we're putting on the x-axis here the level of consumption of the lowest type. And so that poorest group with two parents illiterate, what is their level of consumption? Of course, these countries are much richer than our Middle Eastern countries, and so they tend to have a much higher level. But you can see that Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan, the proportion explained by these four types is about roughly the same, a little higher in Egypt, but roughly the same as these Eastern European countries. So the region doesn't stick out in terms of having much more inequality of opportunity than these Eastern European countries, or much less. I mean, they're roughly the same. Now, the same issues with measurement, etc. I mean, these are still using these very simple four types to get at those estimates. All right, so let's look at Egypt over time. And this is where I think we can tell interesting stories in terms of where this is going. So again, I'm going to start with these cumulative distributions. And here, I think you will see that, first of all, the distribution seems to narrow. In consumption, we start with 98. In wages, we can go back to 88. So the distributions narrow, so you would think that inequality of opportunity is declining over time, which is something I already told you is happening. But look at how the narrowing is occurring. The narrowing is occurring to a great extent by having the middle and upper middle group collapsing towards the lower group. But the upper is pretty much staying in place, more or less. In fact, some of the lower is moving to the right. So in a sense, it's what's going on with the middle is going to be very crucial here. And that's why I wanted to kind of bring up this issue of the middle. Now look at wages, and you can see it a lot more here. So for wages, again, you will see that you start in 88, pre-spread out, but the orange and yellow lines keep coming closer to the light blue line, whereas in 2012, there's hardly any difference between the yellow line and the blue line, and the orange has practically collapsed on top of it. So that just says that the distinction between the middle group, which I call the middle class, and the lower class is disappearing, and the rich are staying where they are. Now, I think that could be a hint about what's going on. It's not about overall inequality, which is kind of looking at, but it's about the fact that inequality is actually decreasing between those three types as you go from 88 to 2012. So inequality in the middle part of distribution is getting smaller. And that could explain why something like the Gini coefficient is going down, because the middle class is disappearing. The middle class is collapsing towards the lower class. And we can think about all kinds of reasons of why that's happening. All right, so this is measuring the relative, again, the lower relative to the upper. And an increase here is a sign that things are getting better for the lower. Their mean wage or their mean consumption is approaching that, is getting closer to that of the upper. And you can see that lower is doing well. They're increasing, it's flattening out a little bit here, but for consumption it's going up. The middle to the upper, there's actually an evidence of a decline here, but again, not very large, but at least it's flat. They don't seem to be improving much. With consumption, there is a little bit of an improvement in 2012. And then the lower to the middle, the lower is catching up to the middle. Right? And that's the key issue here. So this is where the lower is catching up to the middle are not moving very much. Now, we're going to look at the same story, but looking at annual rates of change by type. So what was happening between 88 and 98, everybody's real wage was declining. Everybody was getting worse off. But the middle groups and the upper groups were getting worse off more than the lower groups. So there was a compression. Everybody's wages were declining, but the top was declining more. The top and the middle was declining more than the bottom. And so this is part of the compression of inequality that occurred between 88 and 98. Between 98 and 2006, wages were going up, except the upper middle group was not going up much. So they were kind of being left behind. And then finally, between 2006 and 2012, everybody went up a little bit, but the middle group went down. So this is in terms of just annual rates of change in the real wage. Consumption, you get a similar story. The group that is improving the least is the middle group. And in the latter period, 2006-2012, in fact, those groups declined relative to the bottom. So it's not the poor that are doing worse. It's the middle groups are faring worse. In some cases, the top group is also not faring that well. So now, in terms of, so this is in terms of how the different types relate to each other. Now, in terms of total inequality, and we saw that earlier in the graph, total inequality in consumption is going down. And we have the same pattern here. However, total inequality in wages is going up. That's a bit of a puzzle, in the sense that overall inequality from 98 to 2012 is going up, but the share that is due to circumstances has been declining. And also there seems to be a contradiction between what's happening to wages and what's happening to consumption. So there's something going on with forms of earnings other than wages that is becoming more equal, kind of canceling the effect of the increased inequality in wages. All right, so this is the share due to circumstances. Again, if you think about it, this is the IOP share, the Inequality of Opportunity share. And as I promised, whether you use 4 types or 36 types, it's declining in Egypt. So declining in the share of inequality of opportunity means less can be explained by circumstances and more can be explained by luck or effort or unobserved circumstances. And you can see that, okay, in wages it flattens out, so that the most of the decline is occurring early in the period between 88 and 98, and then things flatten out. So let's look at this, where we look at the source of the inequality of opportunity over time. This is the same thing I had before, where I decompose them into parents' occupation, region, and parents' education. And most of the decline, as you can see, is due to region. So regions are becoming more equal. There is maybe a labor market that is now becoming more national over time. Whereas the share due to parents' education at least from 1998 onwards, is remaining fairly stable. So there's no decline in inequality of opportunity due to parents' education, but there's a huge decline in the share due to region. So regional differences are becoming less important, although parental education differences are continuing to be important. All right. Yes.
Are most individuals, I would imagine most, but do you have a sense of the percentages of individuals that are actually living in the same region as their parents, or is there a disparity?
Yeah, so this is region of birth, where the individual was born,
Oh, okay. It's not
rather than where
okay.
the parents' region. So it's, but still, to the extent that there is some mobility that people migrate
Right.
to improve their lot. So the reason I didn't want to put current region is because that includes effort, right? Migrating is a choice.
Right.
So region of birth is your circumstance. That is, you're born with that, you cannot change it. Whereas you can choose where to go. And so that's why we try to use region of birth rather than region of current residence. But the vast majority, I think migration rates within Egypt are fairly small.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what I was going to ask. What about migration to the cities where the work is? Have you looked at that as a kind of...
Well, in fact, yeah, but what I was arguing is that could be explaining why why the region effect is getting smaller. But what's happening over that time period in Egypt is that migration abroad increased quite a bit and took away from internal migration. So there's not a lot of internal migration taking place, but people are migrating abroad instead as a substitute for internal migration. But to the extent that there is migration, it's still people choosing to migrate to improve their own lot, so that's fair to include in the effort column, as opposed to the circumstance column, which is what you're born with, in some sense. Yeah.
There's no possibility of how strangely things in Egypt are decided as urban and rural?
Yeah, some of that is possible, is that basically urban-rural is based on some kind of administrative rather,
change, right?
yeah. So you have rural villages that have 50,000 people in them, which in most countries these will be small towns. The region variable that we use is metropolitan, which is all urban, and then the provincial we divide into urban and rural. And so it's possible that but what that does is essentially keeps people rural even if
Things haven't changed.
the place they lived has grown dramatically, etc. So, what's interesting is we see this kind of reduced effect of region over time, despite that the parental education remains. All right, now I promised you that we're going to do these formality-adjusted wages. So what we do here is, in fact, I did previous research that showed that non-wage benefits in formal jobs are about the same order of magnitude as the wages. So that you can essentially double a person's wage in a formal job, and that would be equivalent to, and that would be a good sense of how that wage compares to a wage in an informal job. So we did that based on knowing who's informal and informal, and you get a bigger increase in inequality as a result. So formality-adjusted wages have an increase in inequality. However, the share due to circumstances doesn't seem to, the trend anyway in that share doesn't seem to change. We still have a reduction in the share of circumstances in the inequality due to formality-adjusted wages. Again, the difference between 2006 and 2012 is very, very small. So, what would happen if we could observe more circumstances? This is your question, those unobservable circumstances. And so this is where we are using the panel data. And what we're going to be able to get for that is we're going to observe the wealth of the parents, not just their education, but their position in the wealth distribution of the country. We're going to be able to observe the grandparents, because if they're living with their parents and we know information about the parents of the parents, we can do that. And so So again, the wage outcome is observed in 2012, but we observe a whole bunch of additional things about the individuals from 1998. And here is what happens. So this is if you only observe parental education, nothing else. You can explain 13% of the inequality to be due to circumstances. If you add region and some employment variables of the father, you can go up to about 15%. If you add, you kind of have a more complicated statistical specifications, but you still have the same three variables, you can go up even more to 17%. But then if you add to that, so these are kind of more circumstances are being added in the equation. The difference between these two is just we have a bit more detail in the parental education. We have mothers and fathers' education separately rather than added together, so you get a little bit. But generally, if you have the most complicated situation where you have the wealth of the household in which you grew up, and you have the grandfather's characteristics, you can go to approximately 25%. So this kind of answers your question. What if we add more circumstances? Wealth is pretty important. You know, the wealth of the family you grew up in. You can actually, more or less double the amount you explain. So it just tells me that, yes, we are understating, but not by a huge amount. I mean, you're not getting to 70%. You're getting to about 25%. All right, so let's conclude. So, like inequality, when we look at inequality of opportunity, which is kind of this concept that tries to look at circumstances and the part of circumstances that is explaining inequality, it's not unusually high in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. And in fact, it is falling over time in Egypt, and with the biggest decline occurring between 88 and 98, and mostly due to kind of the geographic integration of the country and region becoming less salient as a form of inequality of opportunity. But the key issue here is that the drop appears to be the declining position of the middle class. And this is something that has been, in the people who dealt with the inequality puzzle, have also suggested that what's happening is not the fact that overall inequality is increasing, but that the social contract that was struck with the middle class is eroding. And the middle class used to be able to get an education and get the good life through government work. And now that is not possible anymore. And so education is not translated into good life, and people whose parents are educated are not themselves, their children are getting educated, but that is not becoming middle class existence. And and it's only the elite that is able to essentially get the good life through whether private sector jobs or other forms of wealth. And so it's the erosion of the middle class that explains the decline in inequality, and possibly our measures of inequality of opportunity are also looking at that decline maybe due to what's happening to the middle class. So the main lesson from this is that perception of rising inequality appears to be primarily driven by the middle class, which has seen its relative position being eroded, and it's the middle class that mobilizes. It's not the poor. And that's what we have observed in the Arab Spring. It's the middle class seeing its position erode and saying, wait a minute, our social contract with the government is breached, and we don't have something to replace it, right? We are not seeing the... So hauling out to the middle class could in fact result in falling measures of inequality, which is what we're observing, and education is less salient as a driver of social mobility over time. So that's kind of my conclusion from looking at this work, and it fits with a lot of the people who've been writing from a political economy perspective about it's the middle class, stupid. If you want to understand what's happening in the Arab Spring, look at those people. Look at the middle class and how they're fared over time. And this is what's going to explain the amount of grievance that we've seen, or at least the amount of mobilization that we've seen. Yes?
So just to understand this, you're saying that the lack or the decline of inequality is really just that more people have less access.
Yes. The people who are in the middle.
Equally deprived.
Exactly. That's the difference between inequality, which measures across the entire distribution what are the differences among people, versus polarization, which is another concept that looks at kind of the top versus the bottom, or how people are far away from each other. Inequality really measures degrees of difference across the distribution. And now we have the people who are in the middle are closer to the people in the bottom, so that there is less inequality. But there's more polarization.
And fewer opportunities.
And fewer opportunities.
So if you take this a step further, what you're saying, if the middle class is eroding and they're the ones who drive dissent and mobilize, then those governments have less to worry about?
No, more to worry about, because expectations are coming from your educational achievement. That's how people develop expectations about the good life.
Right.
So having people who are educated achieving less with their education, in fact, makes the government should worry more rather than less.
I'm just thinking over time, if they're...
Well, I mean, they're achieving less with their education, but if you know, education has risen very rapidly in this region. In fact, I was telling the class earlier that out of the top 20 countries with, in terms of increase in educational attainment, 9 are from this region. So with education rising so rapidly, but the returns to that education in terms of income and consumption really not tanking, then you get this very explosive mixture of people who feel entitled, but not getting the result of that entitlement. Yes?
Where does the informal economy fit in all of this? In the beginning and then afterwards when you were calculating incomes? And speaking of calculation, do you use taxation data at all?
No.
What do you do also with corporations that are holding companies of assets?
Yeah, okay. So basically, this is all based on household data, and taxation data is completely unavailable in this region. And that's why the kind of work that Thomas Piketty would be doing for France and the US and trying to look at the very rich, it's mostly using taxation data and just not available. In fact, ERF commissioned him to do a piece of work for Egypt.
Yes.
And at the end, he just threw out his hand and says, I don't have the data. So he didn't. So unfortunately, we're not able to get at income from the taxation data. And with the amount of evasion from taxation, that would be. Now, income retained by corporation that is not actually going to individuals also would not be captured here. Because we're looking here at people's consumption levels and people's wage income. Even if you're looking at full income, I doubt that we're getting people who are benefiting from the large corporation. Again, this missing 5% at the top is a common problem. So those measures. So if inequality is increasing because of kind of increased property income, if you want, at the very top,
Or in stocks or bonds.
in stocks or bonds, yeah, we wouldn't be capturing that very well with this kind of data. But there was another point that you made.
Economy.
Yeah, the informal economy is completely captured here in the sense that this is a household survey. So we're getting all employment, whether formal or informal, and we're getting kind of the income people make in the informal economy. So the big issue here is that the people who get an education and in the past would have gotten a government job are now relegated to the informal economy. And so you see them in informal wage employment in particular, which is the residual category that has really grown as government jobs decline. And so that's where you have the entitled people who expect this government job as a result of the social contract are now being told, no, you have to be satisfied with an informal job for life. Yeah, go ahead. You had a question.
Yeah, I was just, so if you were accounting also for formal employment as well, did this survey capture benefits and security, or was it really just a wage?
Well, so what we calculated here is a wage, and then we had this adjustment for formality where we based on earlier work that said that all the non-wage benefits, which include the security and the vacation and the is about doubling the wage. But this survey does include access to health insurance, access to paid vacations, access to sick leaves. So if you want to do that very nitty-gritty work, it's in the data.
My question's already been answered. It was about the social contract and if there are any other significant factors other than the lack of availability of public sector jobs.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, the nature of this authoritarian bargain social contract is that the state wants the middle class to remain quiet and not voice its political opinions or its make demands in terms of voice, and in return, they will guarantee certain advantages, and those advantages are subsidized commodities like fuel and food, free education at all levels, including the university level, and jobs in the bureaucracy, right? And while they have more or less maintained the two others, subsidized fuel is now in question, but at least subsidized food is more or less still there, and free education all the way to the university level. Of course, the quality of that education may be declining, but it's the government jobs that have gotten the big hit, if you want. Now, what's interesting is that in the case of Egypt, Tunisia, even Yemen, the deal is with the middle class, the people who achieve a certain level of education, and those are the people you want to keep quiet. In countries like the Gulf, the entire national population gets bribed in this social contract, right? They all get government jobs. And it's the private sector, it's for the expatriates. And so they have enough rent, if you want, to be able to bribe the entire national population into quietude or quiescence. Yes?
So I was wondering, it's kind of a methodological question, but sort of how to deal with what's unexplained by circumstance. And I'm thinking, I'm wondering whether you all have started thinking about that, or that's the next phase of this project. But I'm thinking of like a particular example. So the World Bank did this report on children in UNRWA schools and their TIMSS results. And they found that children in UNRWA schools in Jordan, as opposed to public schools, and in the West Bank, as opposed to the PA schools, did better on these TIMSS tests by a year. They compared, right? And so they did a number of, they ran a number of regressions to kind of control for as much of these background characteristics as they could. And then they sort of took the unexplainable, and then they tried to explain it with school-based factors, teacher training, and they said, okay, we can explain this much more. And then the final thing is they actually went out and interviewed some of the most vulnerable kids in these schools to kind of try to tease out what might be happening in the personal circumstance, but what might be happening in these schools that isn't being captured in any of this data. So this to me is just sort of an example of kind of how to try to, and I wondered if this is part of the conversation of or are you still just trying to tease out how to figure out the circumstance? And
Jordan is a bit of a puzzle, because in Jordan is the place we explain the least with the usual social background variables.
yeah.
And in fact, sometimes you get these kind of strange results that are reverse of what you would expect.
Yeah.
And it's because, okay, so when we look at father's education, Palestinians usually have a higher father's education than Jordanians, but they are very disadvantaged in the public sector.
Yeah.
And so what you find is that the people with lower father education, in fact, do better in Jordan than the people with higher fathers with education, and because we're not observing this Palestinian versus Jordanian variable.
But even in Egypt, there's 70% that's not being explained by this. So I know Jordan has put, so I'm just wondering, how do you even begin to try to, because the unobservable / effort, right? It's still a huge percentage of.
Yeah, and I think so. It's the question is what difference is going to make to comparisons.
Yeah.
So what? Let's say you only explain 30%, and you say that unobservables may have another 20%. So long as so what you worry about is that unobservables become more important over time. So that maybe in the beginning it's the quantity of education of the parents, and then after that it's the quality of that education that matters.
And that's unobservable.
And that's unobservable.
Yeah.
And so in this case, the unobservables could be becoming more important over time, and that's why you observe a decline in the contribution of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So you worry about that, but I mean at the end you have to do what's the kind of the state of the art technology that we have in this field is what we can observe in these surveys. Now, the richer the survey is, and the more variables you have about social background, the more you can include that.
Mm-hmm.
But often that prevents you from doing comparisons over time, because if you have the variables now, you may not have had them 20 years ago.
Can I just follow up on that? I mean, so the quality of education, we all know it's deteriorating. But are there a set of statistics to compare, for example, 1988 versus 2012, the number the percentages are graduating in more humanities and literature versus engineering, let's say, or science, where technically you're supposed to earn more?
In fact, we do have the specialization of, assuming university educated, that's a very small group, remember? But for university educated, we do have what field they graduated from.
And has that
all the way
changed?
from 88. Not dramatically. Not dramatically. I mean, it's still the large majority is in the kind of the social science humanities. And I was again telling the class today about some statistics about the inputs that go into this education. So in engineering, you have a student-teacher ratio of 12 to 1. In social sciences and humanities in Egypt, it's 250 to 1. So you just get in terms of what the level of inputs and investment that is going into. And in medicine, it was like 1 to 1. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder, what about perceptions of inequality among people living in the same geographic areas that are based on factors like provision of public services or public expenditure in their own neighborhoods versus in adjacent neighborhoods? Like if people see schools being built in wealthier neighborhoods or a water treatment facility or something like that. And those are things that affect people's sense of well-being, but not so much reflected in consumption or wages.
So that's hopefully the work that Diane and her team are doing. So we don't have in this data very much about kind of the amount of public expenditure that's taking place in your neighborhood. But if you complement the data with things like the sorts of statistics that your group is at, then one can try and get a sense of maybe a lot of the inequality is in the public services and the expenditure on public services. And I think that would be a very fruitful way to go forward. Now, there's no question that in the 2000s in Egypt, it's like real estate and land were a huge source of wealth for a very small group of people, but it kind of really multiplied in a huge way. I mean, real estate prices were quadrupling in a 5-year period. It was so to the extent that that this is driven by things like a lot of that real estate speculation is in the new settlements, in which the government was spending a lot of money on infrastructure. And so, in a sense, this is where public expenditure is driving the wealth inequality through real estate. So I think this is all very fruitful areas for future work. Yeah.
Right. The other things, it's sort of interesting because, I don't know, the message of the hollowing out of the middle class is in a sense, you know, people have noted the demise of the social contract. But the puzzle, as you say, is that there's the question of the perception, like why did all this happen? And actually, inequality is fairly low in Egypt. And one of the things that strikes us is that poverty can be really high, and that just means inequality is low. And so things like illiteracy and poverty, there's a
in fact, the very poor actually improve their status in
Right.
this data. So poverty may not have increased that much. I think that if you look at the numbers, it's been stable.
But it's broad.
It's very broad. And in fact, what happens if you, so let's say you use the usual national poverty line, you get a poverty of about 25%. You increase that very little, you get 45% under the poverty line. So there's this huge lump of people who are right around the poverty line.
And that's where the vulnerability happens.
And that's where the vulnerability happens. So that's where these middle class folks who think of themselves as middle class have kind of come very close to being poor.
And that's some of what we're also trying to do is the public service part, but also the spatial part. So also looking within cities at this, you know, the subnational level, but also, and Danielle's doing a lot of trying to do like adjacency and proximity, and actually clustering to sort of differentiate a little bit more. And then you see some neighborhoods which really pop out.
Pop out as poor or as
As both, really, or that are just very different in many ways from neighborhoods that are right next to them.
Right?
Yeah, I mean there are these enclaves because you have these enclaves of informality in the middle of these rich neighborhoods, and then you also have sometimes a few kind of rich neighborhoods in the middle of a sea of informality.
And you
so
also
have both
like
of them.
sort of we can sort of see like you know, the poverty belt, which is kind of goes through the city because of the spatial and the public's, you know, the spatial dimension kind of in some sense captures some of the public service issues because of the kind of neighborhood and settlement it is. It's a kind of proxy for not a lot of public services. Or
Well, yeah, I mean,
there's
the government kind of gives itself an
correlation.
excuse. Right? The poor lives in informal neighborhoods that are often, the government treats them as illegal and therefore unentitled and therefore not worth investing in, right? And so the excuse is, well, we want to discourage these neighborhoods. We don't want more people like them, but that's where the poor live. And so, and where do the rich live? They live in these new planned communities with a great deal of investment on the public. So in a sense, urban policy is one of the most disequalizing because of this, you know, basically saying those people broke the law, we don't need to be responsible for them. You know,
Part of the problem of the Gini coefficient and all this with the Arab uprising, that it really did not express what was happening about one, conspicuous consumption where people in Cairo or Tunis were seeing, and two, the realization of the increase of corruption. I mean, people are much, much more aware of it than they were in the 70s. So this feeling is, you know, the embezzlement that is taking place is so much at a grander scale than it used to be.
or at least
in the
people
whole
see
region,
it.
or see it more.
It's maybe that it's more perceptible now, and there's
Correct.
more information
Correct.
about it, etc. I don't know. I mean, if it's gone up, actually, the amount of corruption has gone up, but there's clearly more information about it. And at the same time, there's more information about what the neighborhood next door to
Correct.
us,
Right.
and
Yes.
and so the perceptions, as you said, may be driven by the increased information.
Thank you.
Great.
Did you have another question?